Good evening, everybody. I'm going to give us just about one more minute and let folks join before we officially get started. So if you haven't taken the poll yet, please go ahead. We give you activities to do as you wait, and we'll get started in just a sec. All right. Give you a sense of who's joining us tonight. Welcome to all of our 2021 interns. It looks like the rest of us are in the minority here tonight. So thank you for joining. I hope your first week of the internship has gone well. And I know all of your mentors will join me in saying we are really looking forward to hearing about this next Wednesday, about the keynote tonight and about what you've learned this week as you're getting oriented to your summer work. So hopefully you're joining us in a relaxed space where you can really absorb all the great expertise in the room tonight. And you have this great opportunity to engage with these folks who are doing work that you are preparing with this summer. And I see that as a great privilege for all of us. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. It is our second keynote of the summer, the second keynote altogether, the first of the summer, When Black Women Thrive, Inclusion and Equity for a Just Economy. I'm Stephanie Rolfe, the Academic Director for the Shepherd Higher Education Consortium on Poverty. And I'm joining you tonight from the beautiful campus of Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi, which for those of you who are in the deep south is just as rain-soaked as everywhere else around here. So we haven't seen the sun in a while, but we're hopeful. And actually in a place like Mississippi, we don't mind the clouds because once that heat hits, there's no getting out of it until about October. So I don't want to complain too much about that. If you're new to SHEP and you're not familiar with who we are, I'm pleased to welcome you tonight to our event. It's the second of 4 keynote events that we will be hosting throughout the summer, the rest of which you are more than welcome to join. By way of context, SHEP is an interinstitutional collaboration among 24 colleges and universities across the country. All of those institutions are aimed at supporting undergraduate education about poverty through curriculum, through community-based experiences, and a shared summer internship, which we have just begun. So it's week 1 of the internship, and I'm happy to report that we have 157 interns who are participating in 8 weeks of work, and they come to us from 23 colleges and universities who are working with over 100 agencies in cities across the country in a variety of fields. So I won't try to capture all those numbers for you here, but we have a lot of different experiences that our students are participating in this summer. Every summer, our academic program frames the experience of the internship by focusing on a theme that intersects with our 3 student learning outcomes: knowledge, engagement, and responsibility. 2021 has us doing work to examine the ways in which race and poverty intersect, challenging us to explore the complexity of individual experiences that develop out of the systemic injustices that obstruct access, personal security, and thriving. By doing so, SHEP is highlighting the work of innovators in the field who have a lot to teach us about solutions-focused approaches within the field of social justice. So thank you, Anne and Kendra, for being here with us tonight. Tonight's event is going to be recorded and it will be available for later viewing on SHEP's YouTube channel. Please feel free to utilize the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for our panelists at any time during the event. My colleague Danielle is going to be monitoring that. And so as questions occur to you, if you're afraid it's going to fly out of your head, please go ahead and submit. And I promise you that that will not be a distraction for us. So I'm about to transition to tech support now, thankfully, and I'm going to introduce you to your hosts for the evening, each of whom is a current 2021 intern who's working within the area of community empowerment. So we'll begin in order of their appearance during tonight's event with Fatu M. Kaba. Fatu is a senior at Manchester University, majoring in peace and conflict studies with a minor in entrepreneurship. This summer, she's one of 2 interns, both of which are hosting us tonight, who's working with Higher Purpose Co. in Mississippi. Her work revolves around supporting the company's mission to provide financial and material supports to minority entrepreneurs who are working in areas of food, education, health, and art and culture. Higher Purpose is also involved in supporting community dialogue on trending issues that affect Mississippi communities, both indirectly and directly. This summer, Fatu will be working on web and social media content and audit for that, providing new ideas to enhance marketing strategies. And she will be completing research on grant and fellowships for Black entrepreneurs within the community. Fatu will join us in a moment to introduce our speakers. So thank you, Fatu, for stepping forward. Our next host for the evening is Cassidy Farrar, who is a rising senior at Missouri State University, who's studying intercultural communication, English, and advocacy writing. She's currently serving on the executive boards of the American Association of University Women and Planned Parenthood Generation Action. She's also the chief editor of the campus academic journal. This summer, Cassidy is the community building and engagement intern at Hudson River Housing, a nonprofit that works to provide affordable housing and eliminate homelessness in Poughkeepsie, New York. Cassidy is going to be moderating our discussion this evening. Thank you, Cassidy, for being here. We look forward to seeing you. And our final host for the evening is Sanaya Robinson, who is a junior at Elon University. Sanaya is currently creating her own major centered around social justice with a focus on racial equity. She is the founder of Boundless Blackness, a small business built to uplift authentic, multifaceted Black stories and promote the limitless impact of Black culture. Sanaya also works as the social justice lead coordinator at the Center for Design Thinking and as the project leader of the Black Entrepreneur Initiative, both at Elon. This summer, Sanaya is excited to be working with Higher Purpose Co. to uplift their mission of supporting Black entrepreneurs, shifting the narrative of Black storytelling, and building generational wealth in Clarksdale, Mississippi. Sanaya will be offering closing remarks at the end of tonight's event. Thank you, Sanaya, for stepping forward, and we look forward to hearing your reflections on tonight's presentation. So with that, I am going to pull my video down and turn it over to my colleague, Fatu, to introduce our distinguished speakers. Thanks, y'all.
Hello, everybody. My name is Fatu M. Kaba, and I am really thrilled to introduce our 2 amazing speakers, Ms. Kendra Bozarth and Ms. Anne E. Price. I was especially excited to read their work and listen to podcasts where they highlight the unequal distribution of wealth through both systemic and structural racism that has long plagued the US economy, and how this disparity have disproportionately victimized Black and Brown women in a way that make them very vulnerable to poor health condition, lack of economic opportunities, bad working conditions, and other things that magnify and make their living condition very intolerable, especially in time of crisis. I also thought that it was important that our speakers work center around highlighting the so-called or like the hypocritical nature of race-neutral policies and anti-Black policies that are sometimes used by policymakers to ignore the problem and the exploitations that have been done to women within these communities. What made me especially excited about today's event and our speakers is that Their work has not just been focused on policy recommendation and policy briefing, but they have also been actively involved in in supporting women to take part in political campaigns, like organizing, providing education, and supporting these women in a way that they feel like, yes, it's also our responsibility to be a part of the national decision making, and at the same time holding policymakers accountable for the policies they choose to make or the policies they refuse to make and how these policies impact the community. Yeah, and I also learned a lot from our speakers, especially with how we should all be taking accountability for how we engage our community and our stakeholders and the kind of people we elect into office. So on this note, I'd like to introduce you our first speaker, Kendra Bozarth. She's the Director of Communication at Liberation in a Generation, driving its overall communication strategy across editorial, digital design, press, and advocacy. She's especially passionate about narrative change and the Black women best economic framework. Before teaming up with the before teaming up with the Liberation in a Generation, Kendra launched the KBC Comms, a progressive communication consultancy firm, and she's worked as a managing director of communication at the Roosevelt Institute. Prior to joining Roosevelt Institute in 2017, she worked on a state level budget and tax policy campaign in Kansas as a member of the State Priorities Partnership with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And she was the communication manager at the Homecomers with Sarah Smash podcast in 2019. Our second speaker is Annie Price. She's the first woman president of the Insight Center for Economic Community Development. She's worked in public and private She's worked in the public sector on a wide range of issues, including child welfare, hunger, workforce development, community development, and higher education. And work has been featured in the New York Times, The Nation, The Washington Post, The Mercury News, The Wall Street Journal, and other publications. Anne is also a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute in New York. She currently serves as a board chair at the United for a Fair Economy in Boston. Ladies and gentlemen, your keynote speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatu. I really appreciate that.
Yes, thank you. Great to be here.
So great to be here. Yeah, we're definitely, I'm already blown away by the work that you, Fatu, and Sanaya and Cassidy are doing. You're very busy, and I'm very grateful for what you're out there doing in the world. And thank you to everyone for being here. Especially grateful to Stephanie and the entire SHEP team. And we're just excited to dig in. Anne, is there anything you wanted to say regarding introduction before I hop into this?
No, I think that was a very comprehensive introduction.
Perfect. I'll say I'm a little spoiled tonight because I'm good friends with Anne, so I'm excited to be doing this together. So yeah, I know that you all have been digging into some of our work, and so I think we're really here to talk about the Black Women Best framework, to talk about the Centering Blackness framework that Insight's running, and just why, and a big part of our work is, as the title of this event says, that we really believe that when Black women thrive, everyone will be able to have not only inclusion and equity, but a truly just economy, which I think it's important to note and remember that that is something we've never had before. It's not like America used to work and then was broken. It was built broken. It was rooted in slavery and oppression. And so I think it's important to name that, what we're really talking about pursuing is something we've never seen, but that's also no reason to be afraid of it or to put a ceiling on our imaginations, right? So I'm going to just dig in first and quickly just kind of give you my definition of Black Women Best and a little bit of background on that. And then I'll kind of talk about my work on narrative change, and then I'm going to hand it over to Anne. And so as many of you all probably know, I hope you know, Black Women Best is a framework that was actually The architect of that is Janelle Jones. She was the former managing director of policy and research at the Groundwork Collaborative, and she's now the first Black woman chief economist at the Department of Labor. So she's been working on this for a few years, and I think we really, after the COVID pandemic and recession, we just really were ready to like push the pedal to the metal and just run with this, because there was no moment than that to really not only center the fact that Black women and other structurally marginalized groups are just deeply oppressed in disproportionate ways, but that we have to center those people and their experiences if we want to build real policy change. As we know, Joe Biden talks about building back better. I prefer to say, like, let's build back anew. Let's do it, like, burn it all down, start over. And I think how we really can start over strongly is through this framework. And so the too long didn't read version of this that I say is Black Women Best is putting Black women at the center of progressive policy change, ensuring that both their needs and their disadvantages are accounted for, and not only accounted for, but first. And ultimately, we believe, Janelle believes, everyone behind this framework believes that by doing this, we're going to build a more inclusive and equitable policy and economy for everyone. And so before I really dig in, I just want to make two distinct notes. When we say Black women, we're inclusive of all women, all Black women. And so that means Black trans women and Black femme identified people. And so, femmes are anyone who's not a cis or trans woman, but who identifies as feminine or is typically read as feminine, and thus are confronted with a world that inherently holds them back by appearance, right? And so I just want to make clear that when we talk about Black women, we mean all Black women, because as Anne talks a lot about at her work at the Insight Center, as I talk a lot about in my work, true liberation is dependent on dismantling all forms of oppression. And so I say especially the oppression that Black trans women and Black femmes endure. And then I also want to point to something that Fatou lifted, is that Black Women Best is so important to me because for generations, for decades, our economic policies have been built with race neutral. And as Fatou mentioned, that's really just a way to ignore deep-seated structural problems. And my argument is that race neutral policy design is another form of white supremacy. Race neutral assumes whiteness is the norm, and it doesn't work to uproot racist and sexist systems, and it doesn't work to ensure that systemic barriers won't be erected in whatever the race neutral policy design is proposing. And so to me, race neutral is, again, rooted in white supremacy, and it's a dog whistle, it's an implicit way, often unintentionally, but still just as harmful to build policies that hurt Black women and other people of color. And so back to Black Women Best. I love Black Women Best because one of my number one communications philosophies is to be explicit. I say bluff a lot, which is bottom line up front. So not only say what you mean, but lead with the point, lead with the takeaway. Don't bury things in the narrative of where you're going, get there, and then you can get the context on all of that. And so Black Women Best is just a really explicit, really clear framework. And as I was talking about race neutral, a lot of the policies that have harmed Black women and other structurally marginalized groups get to hide below the surface because they're often very implicit. And so to me, Black Women Best, we're naming what we're doing, we're naming why. And I think that's part of why it's such a strong framework. And so one big example of kind of that line I'm talking about between race neutral and Black Women Best, and something we're going to see a lot of in recent months, are deficit hawks and austerity measures. And so austerity is a really insidious way to be implicitly racist and sexist, to hide behind false crises like the national debt, while creating actual crises for Black women and other people of color by cutting public investment, by dismantling public programs. And so one clear example I love to lift where a Black Women Best framework can be applied is state and local government employment is predominantly held by Black women. And so when we cut those jobs, there are disparate impacts that Black women face. And so austerity measures like cutting public sector jobs is, again, implicitly anti-Black. It's anti-Black women best, but it gets to hide behind budget costs and saving money. And so that's a good example of not only race neutral, but dog whistles, and why when we get to name frameworks like Black women best, we can ensure that any policy decision is actually rooted in the ways that we can uplift these communities. And then just a little bit of additional background. I think when Janelle was really working on this framework in the beginning, one thing she was confronted with is that people feel that it's a bit exclusionary, right? It's like, oh, well, you're only talking about Black women, what about everyone else? And in Janelle's view and my view, Black women are arguably the most structurally marginalized group. They have been since the founding of this nation. They face distinct form of oppressions that other groups do not face, in worse ways that other groups do not face. And so by building policy that is rooted in their well-being, their struggles, their aspirations, we're inherently building policy that's going to lift everyone up. And another thing I like to say is that really we've been doing rich white men best for generations, and that's only entrenched inequality. And so let's try the inverse. Let's try something different. So that's kind of like Black women best. Again, too long didn't read. And I just want to quickly talk about narrative change, and then I'll hand it over to Anne to talk about centering Blackness. I think it's really important to note that to me, Black women best is so important and so strong because it's something that hasn't been done. The only time Black women have been centered in politics and policy and the broader story of our economy is when they are being villainized. And so we're being villainized, we're being not only made to feel invisible, but kind of invisible, again, back to that kind of race neutral thing. And so, you know, this kind of channels into my work as a communications person. I'm really, really about narrative change and rewriting the stories we tell each other over and over again. And so though Black women best is a kind of a North Star to guide economic policymaking, I think it's also essential for rewriting the story of our economy. Again, to how Black women have been villainized. Since the beginning of this nation, people in power have used harmful tropes and racist narratives to kind of position Black women as economic antagonists. I'm not going to name or lift any of those kind of false narratives and misconceptions. As Anne knows, I'm really about like what you name, you feed. But I think there's still space to talk about that. But we'll kind of, for one, just so we're clear, like one example is the welfare queen, right? And so that's a story where Black women have been positioned as an economic antagonist, but the reality is we've always been the protagonists, and we should be central to envisioning and building a better future. And so when I think about narrative change and kind of a Black woman best perspective, you know, one example I always come back to is seeing Black women as heads of households and how we can tell more of these stories. Black women are never really named as breadwinners, though many Black women are bringing in most of the income for their families while also caring for these families, and how our families stretch beyond the household, right? They're caring for multiple generations and those outside the home in ways that go beyond financial needs. And so thinking about how we construct more economic stories that elevate Black women in that way instead of the more destructive, villainizing ways is something I'm really thinking about a lot. Another great important thing about this framework and just in doing this work is being sure we're not talking about or for Black women, but giving them a voice to speak for ourselves. A really great example is Magnolia's Mothers Trust has just started a new Front and Center series with Miss Magazine. And so rather than talking about stories about how a guaranteed income can uplift and improve Black women's lives and thus everyone's lives, they've created a space for us to hear directly from these Black women, these Black mothers, to hear about their disadvantages, to hear about their aspirations, and to actually hear about their experience and how they've benefited from policy choices that mirror or are rooted in Black women best. And so that's kind of my quick little rant about narrative change, but that's just somewhere I'm really thinking about. And I'll turn it over to you to talk about centering Blackness.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. That was a lot. And no, it is a lot. And it is an issue that is so multifaceted, but certainly we can't think about change, economic policy change. We can't think about that without narrative change, particularly as it relates to Black women. So I'm so glad you raised that, because we just oftentimes, particularly in our studies, you know, I study policy, we never talked about narrative change, and we don't, and it didn't see it as relative to changing policy, right? But it does. We say that narrative change eats policy for lunch. And so thanks for bringing that in. I want to talk a bit about the framework that we've developed, and it's a centering Blackness framework, and it ties to a lot of tentacles that Kendra just named. And, you know, we really have been thinking about this for a few years. And part of it was because, you know, I have really felt in my work on race and racial justice that our focus on racial equity has still become a bit muddied. I mean, we think of it as a path forward. More people are talking about racial equity. People are trying to embed that in their work. You know, corporations are making statements. But the reality is that we can still move forward with still class-based approaches. We can talk about racial equity without ever talking about racism, which seems, you know, it seems antithetical to talking about racial equity, but it happens actually all the time. So that we can actually not move away from focusing on root causes. And so we developed a centering Blackness framework because we believe that this helps us get to the root cause of why we see such tremendous racial inequities when it comes to our economy. You know, really anti-Blackness is a harm that we're trying to solve for. So let me just kind of lay out a couple of things. First, anti-Blackness and what that is and why we think we must solve for this fundamental harm. You know, anti-Blackness is really baked in to not just our economic policies and economic systems, but all of our systems, our culture, our society as a whole. And understanding that our very foundation was really based on anti-Black racism. And, you know, it's not just that this happened during slavery and disappeared. When we think about our current ways in which we think about our economy, all of that really came from slavery. The way that we think about depreciation came from slavery. The way that we surveil and even labor practices came from slavery, in the sense that, you know, folks were really able to understand how to squeeze more productivity out of slaves. And some of that, the ways in which we think about squeezing productivity out of workers today, have those kind of similar threads. So anti-Blackness, to me, is the foundational architecture in the way that our economy has been built. And to combat it, we have to really confront this foundational harm. And so I'll talk about how that plays out in policy in a minute. But I think the most important thing to think about anti-Blackness is that it really is in relation to our humanity, right? And Black folks have always been the gauge for our nation's humanity. We measure our humanity, and no matter who you are, right, against Blackness. And so when we think about the systems that have been built, particularly those that serve some of the most struggling Americans, they are really built on, you know, on their systems that are truly inhumane, right? They punish, they penalize. That can be found in programs like food stamps, what's called SNAP, or TANF, or Medicaid. even when we think about the child welfare system, these systems are really built on surveilling and punishing people who are participants of those systems. So in that way, anti-Blackness doesn't just affect Black people. It ensnares all Americans who are beneficiaries of many of our economic policies, like the ones I just named, right? This isn't something that exclusively Black people feel. Of course, they feel the brunt of it, but it really harms all Americans. And so even with this framework, we're really saying that if we can solve for anti-Blackness, it could be liberatory for all Americans, right? So we see centering Blackness as a practice, not just a theory, it's a practice of liberation. So, when we, oftentimes when we're in these conversations, people will say, well, what about white supremacy? And why aren't you solving for that? And I thought it's very interesting because essayist Sharronda Brown describes white supremacy this way. She says, it deals exclusively in lies. And it does so because the violence it perpetuates can be justified when white supremacy controls a narrative of pain. So this idea that, there's a system in place right now that is really built on a series of lies. I mean, we can't actually center that. We can't actually center that. What we need to do is counter that. We need a starting place that comes from a place of truth. And really focusing on white supremacy doesn't do that. And it also just keeps you focused on whiteness. And I think that is what got us here in the first place. So for us, when we think about policies like Medicaid expansion and the fact that many states have not expanded Medicaid, and you can think about many states that have done that, the way that Medicaid was actually designed was designed to exclude. It was really designed in a narrative of anti-Blackness, and that has carried forward to this day. So when people are locked out of being able to get health care because Medicaid's not expanded, who's harmed? It's not just Black people. In Mississippi, really more white women are harmed than Black women from this policy. So we don't actually think about that in the ways that help us move to a new framework to actually address what's really ailing us. And this is what's really ailing us. Anti-Blackness is a root cause of harm. So one of the things that we really think is really important in looking at this is many of the points that Kendra just named, that we can actually look at Black women as a way to understand how it could be freeing for all marginalized and oppressed people. There's not a time that Black women have done well when the rest of the country is not doing well. I mean, there's not a time when Black women have really been doing well. So that's never really happened. But if that were the case, it would mean that the rest of the nation is also doing well. And so if we can actually put our attention to, examining policies in a way that they're not excluding and leaving the most marginalized out, which have predominantly been women, Black women, and Latinas, then I think we've moved our country in a much different direction. And actually centering Blackness helps us do that. It helps us look at the narratives that Kendra just named, the harmful narratives that permeate our economy. It helps us examine who's been left out of policy and how many of particularly our safety net programs have been designed and why they continue to harm. I mean, just look right now, there's governors who are going to end unemployment insurance early, right, than what the federal government has put forward. And a lot of the narratives that really predicate UI are around laziness, right? People that don't want to work, people that want to cheat the system. And when you circle back to those narratives, they are really steeped in anti-Blackness. So it doesn't take much for us to think about how policies have been established what we need to be doing is in figuring out how do we dismantle these types of systems and reimagine policies in a way that actually move away from anti-Blackness. And that's the kind of work that we're doing. We're also looking at the relationship of this issue with mass incarceration. And when you think about what's happened to women, particularly as being a growing population of those who've been incarcerated, we've seen the impact that has had on women and Black women specifically. I work on the issue of wealth, and what we found in our research is Black women under 30 who have been arrested. Well, let me say this: white women under 30 who have been arrested have more wealth than Black women who've never been arrested, right? When we look at these kind of outcomes, when we look at the role that even education plays, that Black women with a college degree have less wealth than white women who don't have one. It really shows you how deeply embedded these are in our systems. And so we think that there has to be a new way of thinking about liberation, that it has to be done collectively, that we have to build multiracial solidarity, that, you know, when we think about Blackness, the closer you are to Black, the more you're affected. About 25% of Latinos are Black. Black is not a monolith, as Kendra said. So we have an opportunity to think about this as an organizing principle, actually, to combat and confront how anti-Blackness has been built into our systems. So I just wanted to kind of lay out that framework to say, I think those of us in this racial justice space are really trying to move beyond the status quo and really find ways to operate that will actually not just move the needle on economic well-being, but will actually lend itself to greater sense of liberation, right? A sense of joy, a sense of community, of shared prosperity. And that's what this framework is trying to do. So I'll stop there. That was enough with the framework, and let's continue to engage, Kendra. Where do you want to go from here?
Yeah, no, that was great. I mean, I think you're always great. And that was, I mean, I've heard you speak endlessly, and every time I'm like, whoa, yep, say it, teach me, get it, got it, let's go. I think I definitely just want to quickly touch on your point that using Black Women Best and centering Blackness frameworks as an organizing tool to actually demonstrate how our oppression and our liberation is interconnected, right? I think it's really important to name that, and I appreciate that you lifted that. I think, you know, before we turn it over for questions, I think, Anne, if we can, you and I can both talk about some of the policy, advocacy, and organizing pitfalls and opportunities, and the shifts we need to make to fully realize you know, not only the potential of these frameworks, but the goal we're seeking, right, which is economic liberation for Black women and for everyone. And I can be pretty quick. I think one of the opportunities I see is, you know, the past year has been immensely painful, immensely difficult in just pretty much immeasurable ways. And you know, unfortunately, the uprisings of last year were sparked by George Floyd's murder. You know, I want to first name that in every opportunity you have, like, avoid making this man a martyr, right? Like, he didn't give his life for us. He didn't give his life for this moment. His life was stolen from him. It was taken from him. He was robbed of his future and his family and his spirit. But it did create a global uprising, right? And it really made a lot of people and groups and organizations have to not only get serious about racial equity in their work, but confront that anti-Blackness Anne was speaking about within their own institutions and their own organizations. And so I think what I've seen, behind the scenes with nonprofits and again, advocacy groups and organizing circles is folks wanting to do this work, but not sure what that means. And so again, to use the line North Star, but an opportunity I really see that can help with the shifts we need to make is that I think the Black Women Best framework and the Centering Blackness framework give people a very clear kind of hand to hold going forward in their journeys in this work. And so for me, the opportunity is not only the willingness, but the forced position folks are in to like confront racism and sexism and white supremacy and the patriarchy and all of that. And so an opportunity I see is here, take this lens and run with it. And I will note that as we've seen in the past year with corporations making pro-Black statements and, even progressive nonprofits who don't really practice what they always preach. Really, for me, the pitfall of this opportunity I named is that folks have to be serious about it. Like we have to be for real about doing this work. It's not a company statement. It's not an ad campaign. It's not a moment like this, that kind of a cliche phrase that I'll always be happy to say, this isn't a movement, it's a movement. And so I think also the Black Women Best and Centering Blackness frameworks give people something tangible to hold on to if they're serious about doing this work.
I absolutely agree. I get concerned a bit about this moment because even working with some other organizations and them, I think realizing, wait a minute, this is a lot more involved than we had anticipated. It's not something that you can just simply, put out a paper on or put out a statement. We're talking about really embedding this in institutions, embedding it in policy. And, this takes years and years of work. What we're seeing today with many groups is the work they've been doing for many years. And really the fact that they're standing on, their ancestors' shoulders who were doing this for many years, right? And so this is our life's work. And something that we've been, working towards for a long time. I know in my career, like it's not till kind of almost recently that I could even talk about race. This was something where actually people were like, we can't talk about this, right? And so when we think about even the trajectory of this, it's moved quite quickly in the last 5 or 6 years and has really been accelerated since George Floyd's murder. But certainly it is life's work. And it is, for us to think about this framework, it wasn't something we were just trying to put out as a paper. We're trying to now figure out how to put this into, how to make this a reality, a practice by doing various things, by looking at this and what it would mean in an institution, looking at this and what it means in narrative change. And we've launched a pilot to do that work. And really trying to unravel, systems that are deeply embedded, even the way that, how it works. We're both in nonprofits. We know how it works, and it's steeped in white supremacy. And I think it hurts. It hurts all of us. And so this is life's work that really commands that we work collaboratively, that we dig deep. And, that we don't shy away from uncomfortable conversations. You can't not talk about, racism and sexism without it being somewhat uncomfortable. But, when you're in communities where you can be supported and held, those conversations are really, really possible. And not just possible, our ability to imagine is possible. So I think what we're seeing for some of us who've been doing that work is really trying to push against, really use our imagination in ways that we've been stifled and stymied from, and push for really bold, big policy change and say that we need to, upend this. And we can't go back to the way things were because that wasn't working. So yeah, I think these two frameworks are so exciting because they really open up a possibility that we haven't seen before. I think about the National Welfare Rights Organization and how these were largely Black women that came out of the South, came out of a sharecropping system, joined with other oppressed women, Indigenous women, Latinas, and, said, we need a new way of operating in our economy. I mean, they knew that we need a system of care. They knew that we need a minimal income. I mean, this is what they were pushing on. They also knew that we need to change the narrative about poverty. And we haven't seen anything like that, in the last 50 years in terms of pushing on that narrative of poverty. So, I think about some of the things that we're saying are not as radical as people may think. They're ideas that have been seeded 50, 60 years ago that we're building on, that we're expanding upon. So, we can talk. Let's talk about some of the policies here. I don't know if you want to jump in first.
Well, I just want to say real quick, I also really appreciate you, naming the fact that both of these frameworks are a practice. I think like one cultural shift I'd like to see, especially again within our fields, like the nonprofit spaces and those kind of spaces, is a lot of people think before they can come out with something, they have to have it all figured out, right? And just like Miriam Kaba says, abolition is a practice, like these frameworks are a practice, right? And so part of the work is figuring out how Black women best, how centering Blackness shows up in the world. And part of why it's so important that it's a practice is because I'm not building this work alone. Anne's not building this work alone. Again, when I mentioned, like, we're not talking about or for Black women, like Black women need to be leading this work and doing it in community. And so I just wanted to point to real quick, I really appreciate you naming that, because it's something we'll figure out as we go, right? And as we, we see some of these Black women best policies be implemented, again, to lift abolition. Like one thing Tracy Corder says is like, once we reach abolition and liberation, it's not like we're not going to have any problems. There's just going to be new problems to solve, new problems to figure out. And so this isn't a magical wand that's going to fix everything. And there will always be struggle, but that's part of, again, that practice. So I appreciated that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think the thing is, even when we, both of these frameworks, the question is always, well, wait a minute, what about other groups? And I find it quite interesting because even talking about centering Blackness, makes people nervous. Even saying Blackness makes people nervous, right? And I think, when I think about like Ibram Kendi would say, well, why is that a problem? Right? When he's talking about, focusing on and being an anti-racist, why is that a problem? Why is it met, with such a visceral reaction? And why is it that when we're talking about Black people and Black women, there's already a sense of exclusion and there's a sense of somehow they're not deserving enough. And I sometimes hear that, even though that might be in people's subconscious or that might be unconsciously said, I think to understand how our systems have been built and who they've been built for and who they've been built to exclude would to me lead us back to focusing on Black women, would lead us back to focusing on anti-Blackness, right? Part of it is because we don't want to go deep enough to really understand what the root causes are. But I do think that it's quite interesting that I know the first question I'm going to get. And there's a lot of trepidation by saying we should have this focus. But when you think about what we can do in practice, I think it's a way for us to really, build that, like you said, together. And to do it, to make mistakes and to learn and figure things out. I will just say, like, even in the policy sphere, we continuously give up populations for a win, right? We say, well, all right, they're not going to be covered. Well, this may have this unintended consequence, but we've got to get this passed. What are we going to do, right? We're never willing to actually say, how do we really start with the most marginalized and really, not give in to allowing for so many people, such a large sector of our population to be left behind, and to look at this from an intersectional approach. I mean, we talked about trans women and femme people, and layer that on with people who have disabilities, and just do the layering, and you can see who actually is left behind in our economy. So I think the idea for a practice for us is so critical for us to just experiment and pilot. I love to see some of these pilots that are being done with Black mothers, because I think it's teaching us a lot about what's actually possible. And that's what this is helping us learn, what's possible, and so, yeah, I mean, practice, even talking about policy, there's a practice, like we need to change the way that we actually design our and develop policy in the way that we're willing to concede far too often, because we think we can't win that way.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is what is a win? And I think our wins are even based in kind of white supremacist thinking, right? Because when we look at like how progress, even getting one thing from point A to point B, that's progress, right? It doesn't mean that the policy was passed. And even if a policy is passed, implementation is also very fraught. Mm-hmm. So I think that we want to like peel back the onion on this. Mm-hmm. And really say, what would it look like if we just dealt and really pushed ourselves to focus on root causes, mm-hmm. and structural change?
I'm just pulling up an article real quick because I think, one thing that you just sparked for me amongst many things is that, whenever someone presents a policy or a win, my immediate question is, well, who, for whom? Who does that benefit? Who does that serve? Because as I think we've all seen in the past year, to kind of position, to pivot over to policy a little bit, the unemployment rate, for example, when the jobs report comes out and everyone says, oh, the unemployment rate's down, that's great. And it's like, well, hold on a second, for who? Who is that down for? Because time and time again, which has been true during recessions and not, the Black unemployment rate is far higher than the aggregate unemployment rate. And so again, that kind of speaks to that race neutral element, right? If we only look at things in the aggregate and say, oh, it's all good, we're completely ignoring the reality for many people. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say you really lifted that point for me, and that the unemployment rate is one of these policy avenues that centers our frameworks. It is really something we want the Federal Reserve nationally and also local agencies to get serious about, in how redefining how we measure economic health, and ensuring that we're looking at every layer of that and not just the high level overview. So for me, that's like one big policy avenue that I know you're thinking about. I know folks at Groundwork are running with, and so I'll lift that one. And I think you also, you just mentioned the Magnolia Mothers Trust and guaranteed income. I mean, it's truly Black women best in centering Blackness in action. And just, I will lift, before I turn it back to you, is that what I love most about that program in terms of narrative change, with guaranteed income period, but also with these Black moms, is that we're demanding that we redefine who's deserving. And guess what? Everyone is deserving of a livable income. And just seeing this not only help Black women, but give them space to breathe a little bit, and like space to heal, and maybe even find space for self-care. I mean, some of the findings of what these women do with the money they receive is like finally getting a doctor's appointment for a checkup for the first time in 5 years, right? So we're pushing back about the assumptions people make of what people living in poverty will do with money when they get it. And B, we're pushing back on who's deserving of our fundamental basic needs. So yeah. Anne, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, I'm glad you lifted that up, because I do think that the narrative alone is critical. If there were anything else, even though this has actually doubled women's income, of course, it's had very tangible effects. But this idea about trust and deservedness and who's worthy of being trusted. I know in some of the work that we were, engaged in or happened to really speak to in here in California, in Stockton, I mean, part of that experiment here really showed what people need, which was breathing room, that actually enabled people to, instead of working less, it enabled them to stop and take a risk for another career path. It helped them pay off debt, right? It helped them, I think one of the more important things, be present with their children. So I think I think the thing about these frameworks, which I think is really exciting, that has been missing from more wonky kind of policy thrusts, is other areas of equality of life that we tend to not want to speak to when we're talking about economic policy. Like, we just speak to the financial benefit, right? We don't talk about, what does joy feel like? I mean, I know that, for like a mother that was part of the pilot in Mississippi, saying like, I could take my kids to the ocean for the first time. Like, I think the idea that, and if the pandemic hasn't taught us this, the idea of what it means to, how important a quality of life is, to be able to see family members that we haven't seen, right? To be able to rethink what will bring us joy in our lives and how we pursue that path. And I think that some of this, when we think about narrative change, this helps us kind of move into a realm that's typically not spoken to when we think about policy, because it does get into trust, it does give into deservedness, it does speak to the humanity of folks, right? And I think that's really at the crux of both of these frameworks. It is about humanity, people's humanity, right? And their dignity. And that those things should not have to be earned, right? That's inherent. And it seems like so fundamental, but a lot of our systems say that is not fundamental, So, I think, certainly, one would say, well, what would be some of the policies that could really kind of surround both of these frameworks? And I think that one of them clearly is, how we think about women in the workforce, women of color, Black women specifically. I mean, obviously we've seen what the recession has done here. This is a recession that has pushed out 2.3 million women, and has done so where Black and brown women have bore the brunt of that. And what has that done? It's upended families. Think about, everything that came together in this pandemic that exposed these cracks. And one is certainly our care system. I mean, that was exposed. The fact of who holds what kind of jobs was truly exposed. And so if I think about these frameworks, both of them, we have to deal with the fact that we have a racially segregated labor market. When we think about one of the fastest growing jobs in this country, home health aides, right? Who holds those jobs? Overwhelmingly, they're held by women. Overwhelmingly, they're held by women of color. And we know that they don't have the kind of benefits, that the pay scale is low. We know that the jobs that women are in pay less, period, right? I mean, they just do. And then we look at labor market discrimination on top of it. So if we're going to really think about, not going back to normal, we've got to really think about how to deal with labor market segregation and the fact that women have been, pushed into jobs that are insecure, don't have employer benefits, that are low paying. And so I think that there's a lot we can think about in terms of anti-Blackness and Black women through those types of solutions. And it's not just job training. We know it's not that, right? It's really understanding how do we actually start to deal with this hierarchy of a job market, of a labor market that we have. So that's obvious. In the care sector and the care infrastructure is another. I don't know if you want to dig in on that at all.
No, I think we can probably turn it over for questions soon since we're running out of time, but I just want to name that, you just kind of really dug deeper on what you mentioned earlier, is that obviously the pandemic and recession aside, these frameworks really force people to confront who's being left behind, right? And so, yeah, I really appreciate you delving deeper on that. Stephanie or Cassidy, do we want to switch to questions? I just want to make sure we have time before we're up.
Thanks for that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, we can go ahead and switch to questions. Again, my name is Cassidy Farrar. I'm from Missouri State University, and I'm interning with Hudson River Housing in Poughkeepsie, New York this summer, but remotely. So yeah, I'm just going to start off with something I was thinking about. I'm so honored and humbled to be listening to you all speak and being able to speak with you now. And I was really interested in what both of you said at different points in your discussion about narrative and language. And because I study communication, that's something I'm really interested in, because our everyday language can really work its way into policy and how people see things broadly. So in kind of the information age, how a lot of advocacy work and the way people are learning about things for the first time is happening online, can both or either of you speak to the challenges and benefits of that language being so fast moving and coming from a lot of different directions?
Yeah, I can hop in first. First, thank you for lifting language matters, right? Notice when Anne was talking about women who've lost their jobs and the high rate of women who've lost their jobs this past year, she said they were pushed out, right? We see a lot of headlines that say 2.5 million women left the workforce. They didn't leave the workforce. They were literally pushed out of the workforce. And so I'll just quickly, I wanted to name that. I think for me, again, to lift another element of my communications philosophy is, when I first started working in public policy, I was working at the state level in Kansas, truly working with the legislative sessions, go for 6 months, plan for 6 months and back at it. And there I really developed the philosophy about being relentless. I think a lot of people think, oh, we can name this thing and move on. And it's we have to rename it and restate it and reshape it and restate it and over and over and over again. And so, honestly, for me, I'm a little tired of staring at screens all the time, but I am really happy that it's just with everyone online. It's just that's just more eyes for me to be relentless. And whether it's at LibGen or working with Anne and other groups, continually and relentlessly naming what's wrong, what the solutions are, and who we need to listen to. So that's kind of where I go with that question. Anne, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, just quickly, I totally agree. And I think that it really shapes our solutions. You name one way language has been utilized. I'll use another. We think about the Great Recession, the foreclosure crisis. We say people lost their homes. And I love one of my colleagues who said, I lose keys, but I have rarely lost a home. People didn't lose their homes were taken. And think about the narrative, homes that were stolen. They were taken. It's far different than saying you lost your home, because it's saying something you did was wrong, right? Something that you did not a budget, you got yourself into a bad deal, and not saying this was a systemic issue. So the way language is used can really hide that it's a structural issue and put the onus back on individuals. And that's why it's so important that we think about how that's utilized and how that shapes our understanding and worldview. So I think that it's something that too I'm continuously learning. Also, the fact that we don't want to name who's responsible. Wealth grew for the top 1%. It did not grow. They took the wealth that we created and hoarded it. That's what happened, right? that by not really naming who's responsible, whether you say government officials did this, like, we often use very passive voice to say something happened, but won't want to name it. And I think that's very new for folks, because it now is like, oh, I have to name that this was, the elite or a government official, but it's really critical that we do that.
Yeah, I think that's so important in that naming, we often want to talk about the oppressed, but we don't want to talk about the oppressors. And so I think that's so important in naming that, this is a poverty event. And so, I think I'm seeing more folks adopt the language that poverty is a policy choice, which is absolutely true. And I keep pushing folks to take it one more step further to name who's making those choices, right? It's a policy choice made by policymakers, predominantly white policymakers. And so I think it's really important to, like Anne said, not use passive language. And when we're being explicit, let's be fully explicit.
Yeah, absolutely. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to go ahead and move on to just one more question. We'll see what kind of time we have. But the first one that I've got here, Grace asks about the balance that you see between working within the system versus working outside of the system to manifest the ideals of Black women best. They said, I hear a focus on changing policy and also a drive to imagine the economy that has not yet been invented. So how do you engage in both of those types of work in a way that's harmonious?
Yeah, and I can go real quick. That's a great question. It's also like, it goes back to like, this is a practice, right? Because that's definitely a question I think about. I mean, I'm personally ready for capitalism to go. I don't want to reshape it. I want it out and I want to start over, right? And so I think a lot of times it's a balance, this working within the system or working outside the system is also a balance of what can we shape now? What can we reshape now? But what do we need to like wholly rebuild, like wholly dismantle and reconstruct? And I think this question also speaks to kind of challenging the status quo. Like I call myself a disruptor a lot. Like, when I first got into the nonprofit field, I really struggled with like this idea of professionalism. And it's like, well, it's the same brain. It doesn't really matter what I'm wearing or like how I say it, right? And so I think this question of like the balance between working within the system and outside of the system is like, again, what I mentioned, like when do we need to demolish and when do we need to disrupt, which I don't have an easy answer for, but I think it's an important, like, again, kind of North Star question to keep top of mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think at a more narrow perspective, meaning just like thinking about a particular practice or policy. I mean, I've worked both as an advocate and have also worked within government and have worked, have had coalitions that have, gone in between. We talk about having an inside and outside strategy, and it's certainly needed. We did some work here in the Bay, started our work around addressing criminal fees that are imposed by governments on top of fines. We were able to work with the Office of Financial Justice. And so having a government entity that's also doing the workings with other government folks and having a coalition that's pushing on the system and impacted people, leading the way in terms of strategy and direction is really important. So like, you do need both of those things. And honestly, working within systems, there's a lot of really jacked up practices that oftentimes people can't see, right? And so, you have people within those systems trying to dismantle some of those practices that are more harmful than the policies themselves, right? And how they get carried out. And so both of those are really important for, the work we do at a local or state level. To actually move the needle. You need both, and you need to understand how they work. You know, people were just like, if the government should just stop doing this and not realizing there's 20,000 rules and regs and you're trying to combat those. And so you need to really have that nuanced understanding.
Yep.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm going to move on to a question that was submitted beforehand by Peggy from Missouri State. This was addressed to Kendra specifically. She said the brief mentions that the communities would have direct input in identifying, she's talking about the Black Women Best brief, and identifying projects that address long-term physical and care infrastructure needs. And she's essentially asking here, who are we defining as community and who constitutes as that? And how do we, she moves on to say, how do we hold people accountable to taking care of that community?
Yeah, thank you for that. Part of what she asked and what you provided with me before is about, you know, making the distinction of community between individual people and local officials that oversee a community. And I think that's both an important distinction. And so to me, when I'm talking about communities, I'm talking about both. I'm probably usually leading with the actual people outside of government who exist in a community and you know, are neighbors of one another, but also those people who do oversee, you know, whether elected or appointed, those local officials who do oversee that community and that government are part of that too. And so part of the work I do with Liberation in a Generation, which we really work to help support organizers and their campaigns and their movements, is helping them build the infrastructure within their communities and neighborhoods that ensures that the people who are elected are appointed are in fact representing the needs of the people they're in office to represent. And so that's a lot of infrastructure building. Again, that's a lot of, I mean, how often have we seen in you know, past elections where it's like, well, I'm the expert on the economy. I've been a politician for 10 years. And it's like, people who live in the economy, first of all, people are the economy, and people who live in the economy are the experts on the economy. They know how to not only endure, but overcome oppression. You know, I think it was Fatu who mentioned at the beginning that we like to talk about individual anecdotes, but individual experiences are born from systemic oppression and injustice, right? And so I think, you know, I think basically one way I like to think about, you know, building infrastructure that ensures that community voices are being heard and included and centered in community decisions is, you know, I think for a long time, a lot of people said, we just need a seat at the table. But first of all, we want to build a whole new table. So I think like rethinking how does this kind of community relationship show up? What does that mean? Do we need to redefine that? But then again, to that infrastructure point, working within community to ensure that decisions and policy solutions are not only being made by the people who are affected, but like being built by them. So I'm not sure if I fully answered that question. I think I did. But basically, yeah, I see community as very multidimensional, but to the two things that they named, I think there's a bridge with the people who reside in these communities and who don't officially hold power, figuring out how they are in charge and in the lead.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I think this is going to be our last question that we've got time for, and this is going to be extended to both of you. Submitted by Katie. They asked, in discussions surrounding our current anti-Black systems, do you think implementing Black women best in our economic system can happen alone, or will an equitable and race-centered change need to happen across all systems for its full potential to be realized?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think, you know, since we've talked about this as a practice, I like to just see one thing happen, right? I was talking about, can someone who's really pushing on certain policies, can that happen in that policy development? Can we see what would happen if it was actually realized through one effort? You know, because there's so much interconnection and overlap of issues, it's really, really tough in the way that our systems operate and how siloed they are. But I think that we haven't even, gotten to the point where we've actually done that kind of piloting, right? Especially in the policy realm. I think certainly in terms of programmatic programmatic work and design, there might be, but even that has not really been done in the way that we can see. So I just think that we have to demonstrate, to show, because I know people hearing this say this sounds very theoretical, like how will it actually work? I think we need to find ways bit by bit, because this work is done bit by bit. I will do my job. I will move on, I will pass on, and other people will pick up the mantle. So this is long arc. This is the long arc. But we're saying, where can we start? Can we start somewhere, right? Can we start with a program? Can we start with a policy? Can we really see what's actually possible if we actually begin to do this? I don't know what you think, Kendra.
I 1000% agree with you. I think one thing I like to say a lot is that race is not an issue, it's every issue. And so the fact that systemic racism, systemic sexism are just inherent to literally every aspect of our society, again, in very obvious ways, and dangerously also in very kind of hidden, insidious ways. I don't think it's going to be, one big moment, like one wave of the Black Women Best wand that's going to fix it all. I think, again, to reiterate what Anne's saying, it's a practice. And I think it's going to be something that, we make more real for people as we see it in these, again, like this guaranteed income pilot with these Black moms. Like, that's a really substantial way to demonstrate Black Women Best. And so I think it'll be, because to me, I see Black Women Best in endless ways, right? And so I think just demonstrating that and knowing that it's gonna be one step at a time, or 10,000 steps at a time, it's just inherent to this practice.
Thank you both so much for answering these questions and talking with me. I really appreciate it. I think we're gonna move to Sanaya for closing remarks.
Hello, thank you, Cassidy, and thank you to our wonderful speakers. That was phenomenal. Again, I am Sanaya Robinson. I am a junior at Elon University, social justice major, and I'm working with Higher Purpose as an intern this summer. Thank you again. I'm so grateful to share this space with you and learn from you. Thank you so much for your work centered around not only changing mindsets and narratives, but policies and those really important frameworks. And as you both touched on, the structures that have been oppressive to Black women and other communities are so deeply rooted and historic, which is why, as you mentioned, Kendra and Anne, these systems of oppression must be burned down and dismantled and reconstructed. And I also really appreciate your emphasis on including all Black women in our various layers and our various multi-dimensions in your advocacy work, and shamelessly calling out white supremacy and the ways that it seeps into our systems, even as we're trying to do that reconstruction work. So tonight's presentations and discussions really resonated with me as a Black woman. And I think we can all take from tonight the importance of prioritizing Black women thriving and prospering, as this doesn't only benefit the Black community or Black economics, but all of our communities and all of our economic states. When Black women thrive, all of our communities thrive. When Black women thrive, our country thrives. And when Black women thrive, our world thrives. And I think it's really important to remember that in moments like holidays, like Juneteenth coming up soon, and Black History Month, and even the summer of 2020 and the events that happened then, when we see individuals and corporations supporting Black women when it's popular or when it's trending, but when those moments end, that support kind of diminishes as well. So we must protect and respect and defend and advocate for Black women, even when it isn't convenient or it isn't popular, or even when Black women aren't in the room. And as you both mentioned, Black women are constantly on the front lines in the role as essential workers and caregivers. And we've been exploited for our labor and our creativity and our talents and so many other things that have built our economy. So I respect and hope to uplift the ideas that you all discussed tonight regarding making the economy better for Black women, the ones who have been the most structurally oppressed, therefore making it better for everyone else too, but also supporting Black women simply because of who Black women are, because we are human, because we are worthy of flourishing and prosperity, simply because of the authenticity of who we are. So thank you all so much again. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I wish everyone the best, and I hope to see you all at our next keynote on June 24th. Stephanie should be putting the link to that in the chat, and I hope everyone has a great night. And thank you, Ann and Kendra, again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you.